The wound happened on a Wednesday morning at the Cowboy crossroads store, which was not a place where wounds typically happened. And it happened because a wagon wheel had come off its axle, and the axle had swung, and he had been standing in the wrong position, and the axle had taken a 6-inch path across the outside of his right arm, just below the elbow, and the path was not shallow. His name was Fletcher Harrow, and he was 40, and he ran a spread on the North Callaway Range, and he had been at the crossroads store on a Wednesday morning for the same reason he was there every third Wednesday, which was the supply run. And the supply run had included a stop at the wheelwright 2 doors down to pick up a repaired wheel. And the repaired wheel had been loaded into the wagon. And the loading had gone wrong in the specific way that loadings went wrong when a person did not account for the distribution of weight in a wagon bed that was already half loaded, and the wheel had shifted, and the axle had swung, and here he was on the steps with his hand pressed against the arm. He was sitting on the steps outside the store with his hand pressed against the arm when he saw the woman at the water trough across the road. She was standing at the trough, and her hands were in the water, and she was shaking, not shivering, not cold, but shaking in the specific way of a person whose body was doing something her mind was not directing it to do, and the shaking was in her hands and in her shoulders, and had been there when he first sat down on the steps and was still there 5 minutes later. He looked at the arm. He looked at the wound. It was bleeding steadily, which was not good, and the depth of it was difficult to assess with his hand over it, which was also not good. He looked across at the woman. The woman at the trough was the only person visible at this end of the Callaway Crossroads Road at this time on a Wednesday morning, which was a fact he was registering with the specific attention of a man assessing available options. He looked at the arm again. He had noted the shaking when he first sat down. He had continued to note it over the 5 minutes since, because a rancher in his 14th year of running a spread had developed the habit of noting things that were in his environment and assessing whether they were relevant to whatever he was currently dealing with, and the shaking woman at the water trough was in his environment, and he was currently dealing with a wound that needed stitching. The relevant question was not whether she was shaking, but whether the shaking was the kind that stopped when the hands had something to do. He could not answer that question without asking her to do the thing, and asking her to do the thing was what he was going to do. He called across to her. He said, "Can you stitch this?" She looked up from the water trough. She looked at him, and she looked at the arm, and she looked at her hands, which were still shaking in the water of the trough, and she looked at him again. The looking took perhaps 5 seconds. He waited through the 5 seconds without pressing, because pressing was not going to help, and waiting might, and he was a patient man with a wound that was not immediately life-threatening, and he could give her 5 seconds. She said she could. She dried her hands on her skirt, and she crossed the road, and she looked at the wound with the specific quality of assessment that he recognized as the assessment of a person who had seen wounds before and was reading this one rather than reacting to it. She did not flinch, and she did not perform not flinching. She read the wound the way he read a pasture, for what it was actually telling him rather than what it appeared to be at first look. What she said was that she needed a kit, and she had one in her bag, which was at the rail where she had tied her horse. He said he would wait. She got the kit. She was still shaking when she came back. He could see the shaking in her hands when she opened the kit, and the shaking was not the shaking of someone who was frightened of the wound or of the work. It was a different kind of shaking, and he had seen enough different kinds of shaking in his life to know that this one was the kind that came from somewhere inside rather than from the present situation. The present situation was a wound on steps on a Wednesday morning. The shaking was from somewhere else. Her name was Elsa Crane, and she was 34, and she had been a physician's assistant for 6 years before she had stopped. And the stopping had happened 14 months ago, after a patient she had been managing had died, in a way that she had not been able to prevent, and that she had, for 14 months, believed she might have been able to prevent if she had done something differently on a specific morning. The specific morning had been an ordinary morning in the way that ordinary mornings were. She had assessed the patient at 7, had noted his condition was unchanged from the prior day, had made the standard adjustment to the treatment protocol, and had moved to the next patient. The patient had died at 10. The attending physician had reviewed the case and had said there was nothing she could have done differently that would have changed the outcome, and the physician was the kind of physician whose assessments she had trusted for 6 years, and she had trusted the assessment intellectually and had not been able to trust it in the specific part of herself where the doubt lived. The doubt was not about the patient. The doubt was about the morning's assessment. Had she been as thorough as she could have been? Had she noted something and failed to follow through on what she had noted? Had there been a sign she had not read correctly because she was tired or distracted or had moved through the assessment too quickly? The doubt did not have a specific answer because the morning had not been documented in the granular detail that would have allowed the doubt to be assessed, and the non-documentation was standard practice, and the standard practice had become the source of the doubt, and the doubt had been the thing that had stopped her. She had not stopped because she was incompetent. She had stopped because she could not continue to assess patients when she was uncertain whether her assessments were accurate, and the uncertainty had no resolution she could access. And the uncertainty with no available resolution was the thing that had made the stopping the only honest option. The shaking had started approximately 3 months after the stopping. It came and went. It was not constant, but it came when she was near the things that reminded her of the work she had stopped, and the wound across the road on the arm of a stranger had been the first wound she had been near in 14 months, and her hands had gone into the water trough to manage what was happening to them, and the shaking had been there since. She had been at the Callaway crossroads because she was passing through. She was not a person of the North Callaway range. She had been traveling in the specific aimless way of a person who needed to be moving and did not yet know where she was going. And the crossroads was where she had stopped to water the horse and had stood at the trough with her hands in the water. She had not expected to be asked to stitch a wound. She had not expected to say yes. She had said yes because the man had asked her directly, and the directness had produced a response that was different from the response she would have had to an invitation or a suggestion, and the different response was the yes, and the yes was what had gotten her across the road with the kit. She sat beside him on the steps, and she opened the kit, and she laid out what she needed in the order she needed it, which was the order she had learned in the first year of the 6 years, and had not varied from since, because the order existed for reasons and the reasons were still good, and the laying out was precise and the precision was visible, and he noted it without commenting on it, because commenting on it would have been commenting on the shaking by implication, and the shaking was hers to manage and not his to remark on. He was also noting something else, which was that the laying out was the laying out of a person who had done this many times and whose hands knew the order without consulting the mind, and that quality of muscle memory was not a quality that left a person from 14 months of not using it. The knowledge was in the hands. Whatever had stopped her had not taken the knowledge from the hands. She threaded the needle, and the threading took longer than it would have taken before the shaking. And when the thread was through, she held the needle in her right hand, and she looked at the wound, and she said she was going to clean it first, and she cleaned it. And the cleaning was careful and thorough in the way of a person who knew what they were looking for and was looking for it. And what she was looking for was everything, not just the obvious wound, but the tissue surrounding it and the quality of the bleeding and the skin response at the margins, and she found everything and assessed it and proceeded. She began the stitching. The shaking stopped when she began, not immediately. It took 30 seconds, perhaps a minute, and during those 30 or 60 seconds, he could feel the slight irregularity in the pressure of her hands, and he held still, because holding still was what she had asked him to do, and it was the thing he could do. And then the irregularity was gone, and her hands were steady, and the steadiness was complete, and was the steadiness of hands that knew what they were doing, and were doing it without any part of themselves in opposition. She was working from the proximal end toward the distal end, which was the correct direction, and the spacing of the stitches was consistent, and the depth was consistent, and the tension was correct. And he knew enough about wound closure, from 14 years of running a spread where wounds happened to men and animals with reasonable regularity, to know that what was happening to his arm was being done correctly. Then she stopped. She did not stop because of difficulty. She stopped with the specific quality of attention of a person who has found something unexpected and is examining it before deciding what to do about it, and she said she needed to tell him something. He said he was listening. She said the wound was deeper at the proximal end than it had appeared from across the road and had a fragment in it, and the fragment needed to come out before she closed the proximal end, or the closure would trap the fragment, and the trapped fragment would cause an infection, and removing the fragment was going to be more uncomfortable than the stitching had been, and she needed him to hold still through it. He said he would hold still. She said she was going to do it now. He said he was ready. She removed the fragment. She used the forceps from the kit, and the fragment came out in one piece, which was the preferable outcome, and she showed it to him. A splinter of dark wood, perhaps 3/4 of an inch, with the specific grain of hardwood. And she said there it was, and she set it aside, and she cleaned the proximal end again, and she closed it with 3 additional stitches, and then continued down the wound. And when the last stitch was in, she tied it off and dressed the wound and sat back on the steps. He looked at the arm. He looked at the dressing. He said she had done that very well. She said she had not done it in 14 months, and she had been wondering whether she could still do it. He said he had noticed the shaking. She said she knew. He said he had asked her anyway. She said she knew that too. He said, why had she said yes? She was quiet for a moment. She said she had said yes because he had asked her directly, and asking her directly was different from being invited to consider doing it, and the directness had produced a different response in her than the invitation would have, and the different response was the yes, and the yes had produced the stitching, and the stitching had produced the stopped shaking, and the stopped shaking was information she had not had 14 months ago and now had, and the information was that her hands remembered what to do when they were doing it, even when the rest of her had forgotten that they did. He said he had not known any of that when he asked. She said she knew. She said he had asked because the arm needed stitching and she was there and he needed someone who could do it. He said yes. He said he was glad she had been there. She said she was glad too. This is Dusty Vows, where the wound was the beginning, and the beginning was a question asked across a road to a shaking woman. And she said yes. If you want the next story the moment it lands, subscribe now. Then, back to the steps. He said he had a question. She said she was listening. He said what had happened 14 months ago. She was quiet for a long time in the way of a person deciding whether the question deserved an answer and from whom and in what setting. She said a patient had died. She said she had been managing his care, and he had died, and she had believed for 14 months that she might have done something differently on a specific morning and the different thing might have changed the outcome. She said the attending physician had told her there was nothing she could have done differently that would have changed the outcome, and she had trusted the physician's assessments for 6 years and had not been able to trust that one, and the not trusting had been the thing that had stopped her. He said, was the believing still the way it was? She was quiet for a long time. She said it was different now. He said in what way? She said she had just stitched a wound correctly, with a fragment she had found and removed before closing, and her hands had been completely steady for the entire procedure, and a person whose hands were completely steady through a procedure was not a person who had lost the skill that was causing them to believe they might have done something differently. She said, if the skill was intact, then the question of whether the different thing would have changed the outcome was a question about the specific morning rather than a question about her general competence, and the question about the specific morning was probably answerable, and the answer was probably no. And she had known the answer was probably no for 14 months and had not been able to hold the probably no because the shaking had made it feel like a false comfort rather than a true assessment, and the steady hands made it feel like a true assessment. He said the probably no felt different now. She said yes. She said it felt like a thing she could face rather than a thing she was turning away from, and the facing was what she had needed, and the facing had required the steady hands, and the steady hands had required the wound, and the wound had required the asking, and the asking had required him to be standing in the wrong position when the axle swung, and the wrong position was not something either of them had planned. He said he was glad the axle had been poorly loaded. She said she was glad too, approximately. He said he had a thing to say. She said she was listening. He said his spread needed a person with medical knowledge. He said he had 14 years of evidence that spreads needed people with medical knowledge, and he had been doing without for the past several years, and the doing without had produced situations that a person with medical knowledge would have handled better than he had. He said he was not asking her to come back to the work full time. He said he was asking her to come to the spread and be the person with medical knowledge the spread needed, which was a lower urgency role most of the time with occasional necessity. And the occasional necessity was the kind of thing her hands had just demonstrated they could handle. She said he had known her for 40 minutes. He said yes. He said he had seen her hands shake, and he had asked her anyway, and she had said yes, and her hands had stopped shaking, and she had found a fragment that he would not have found, and she had removed it before closing, and the closure was correct. And that was 40 minutes of evidence. He said 40 minutes of evidence was more than he would have gotten from 6 weeks of ordinary acquaintance with a person who had not yet been required to do the necessary thing. She said she had been traveling when she stopped at the crossroads. She said she did not have a destination. He said he was not asking her to stay permanently. He said he was asking her to come to the North Callaway range spread and stay for long enough to determine whether staying longer was something she wanted to do, and the determining could take as long as it took. She said, what if she determined it was not something she wanted to do? He said then she would leave and be no worse off than she was before the axle swung. She said, and what if she determined it was something she wanted to do? He said then they would discuss what that meant. She said that was a reasonable offer. He said he thought so. She said she had a question. He said he was listening. She said the probably no, the probably that the different thing on the specific morning would not have changed the outcome, was probably no, not certainly no. She said she was still going to be carrying it when she came to the spread, and it was going to take time to work through, and the working through was going to be visible sometimes, and she wanted him to know that before he made the offer. He said he knew. She said, how did he know? He said because she had told him about it on a Wednesday morning on steps outside a crossroads store 40 minutes after he had been a stranger. And a person who told things like that to strangers on steps did not hide the working through, and the not hiding was a quality he could work with. She was quiet. Tell me, when she said probably no and not certainly no, did you hear the honesty in that? She was not cured. She was not healed. She was facing the question she had been turning away from for 14 months, and she was doing it with probably rather than certainly, and the probably was the most honest thing she could offer, and he heard it as the most honest thing she could offer. Leave your answer in the comments. I read everyone. Now, back to the steps. She said Elsa. Her name, the first time she had said it to him, with the weight of a name that had been the name of the physician's assistant who had stopped for 14 months and was now the name of the woman who had stitched the wound correctly and found the fragment and held her hands steady for the entire procedure and was sitting on the steps at the Callaway Crossroads store on a Wednesday morning. He waited. I'm not going anywhere. She said it the way she said things she had just decided, which was plainly and as a fact that surprised her as much as it might surprise him. She held his gaze. You asked me directly, and the directness produced the yes, and the yes produced the stitching, and the stitching produced information I have needed for 14 months, and I am not going anywhere, and the probably no is probably no, and not certainly no. And I am going to face the question at the North Callaway range, spread with my hands that are steady when they are working, and I'm not going anywhere. As if it were the simplest arithmetic in the world. Fletcher Harrow. Her name for him said the way a name sounded when it had been the name of the man with the wound on the steps who had noticed the shaking and had asked anyway, and had held still through the fragment removal and had said he did not want her to answer today, and had listened to probably no, as though it were the most honest answer she could give, which it was. He nodded once. The matter was settled. The wound was closed and the fragment was out, and the dressing was on, and Elsa Crane was on the steps at the Callaway Crossroads store, and she was not going anywhere. She said she had a condition. He said he was listening. She said she was not a physician. She said she was a physician's assistant who had stopped practicing 14 months ago and whose license was current, but whose confidence was not, and she was not going to represent herself as more than she was. He said he had not asked her to be a physician. He said he had asked her to be the person with medical knowledge, and the person with medical knowledge she was. She said she was also going to continue working through the probably no, and the working through was going to be visible sometimes, and she was not going to hide it. He said he had already said he knew that. She said she knew he had already said it. She said she was saying it again because saying it once and hearing it acknowledged was different from saying it twice, and the second time established that it was a settled matter rather than a stated intention. He said it was a settled matter. She said good. He said Elsa. Her name, the second time, with the weight of the second time, which was the weight of a settled matter and a physician's assistant whose license was current and whose hands were steady when they were working, and who was going to come to the North Callaway range spread and work through the probably no in a place where her hands had something to do. She said, Fletcher, his name, the second time, with the weight of a name that had been the name of the man at the crossroads who had asked a question that required a yes. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He said the fragment was 3/4 of an inch. She said yes. He said he would not have found it. She said probably not. She said fragment wounds of that depth and that width were easy to miss on initial assessment, and the fragment would have presented as infection within 3 to 5 days. And by the time the infection was visible, the fragment would have been harder to remove. He said so she had saved the arm from a difficult subsequent infection. She said yes. He said that was what the title should have been. He said, she came to the crossroads and saved the arm from a subsequent infection. She said that was less poetic. He said he knew. She said she would see him at the spread. He said he would show her the place where he kept the medical kit, which needed updating. She said she would bring her own kit. She said her kit was better than anything most spreads kept. He said he thought that was probably true. She had come to the water trough to manage what her hands were doing, and she was not going anywhere. And the distance between those two things was 1 wound and 1 fragment and 1 correct closure and the stopped shaking. And the stopped shaking was the information. And the information had changed the weight of the 14 months. Not lighter, she was not going to pretend it was lighter, but different in quality. It was the weight of a thing that was accessible rather than a thing that was not, and accessible things could be faced, and facing was what she was going to do, and she was going to do it on the North Callaway Range at Fletcher Harrow's spread. She had stitched the wound, and she had saved more than the arm. What she had saved beyond the arm was the probably no, which had been available to her for 14 months and had not been accessible, and the stitching had made it accessible. And the accessible probably no was the thing that was going to let her face the specific morning rather than carry it, and the facing was going to happen here. And here was not the Callaway Crossroads, here was the North Callaway Range spread, and she was going there, and neither of them was going anywhere. The wound was on the arm, and the arm was going to heal correctly, because the fragment was out, and the closure was correct, and the dressing was right, and the wound in the other place, the one that was not on the arm, was going to heal correctly too, for the same reason, which was that it had been addressed rather than avoided. And addressing rather than avoiding was what she did when her hands were working, and her hands were working again, and both of them were going to be on the North Callaway Range, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the matter was settled. She had been a physician's assistant for 6 years, and she had stopped for 14 months, and she was not stopped anymore, and the not stopped was here, and the here was the North Callaway Range, spread where her hands had something to do, and both of them were going to be there, and neither of them was going anywhere. And the spread was outside Callaway on the North Range Road, and the Wednesday morning was still the Wednesday morning it had been when the axle swung, and the axle had swung correctly, and the wound had been the wound it needed to be, and the fragment had been the fragment that needed finding, and the finding had been the thing that established that the skill was intact, and the intact skill was the thing that had made the probably no accessible, and the accessible probably no was the whole of what she had needed, and it was here, and she was going to the North Callaway Range spread, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the matter was settled, and the arm was going to heal, and both of them were staying. The question across the road had been the right question to ask. He had not known that when he asked it. He had asked it because it was the available question, because she was the available person, because the arm needed stitching and he had no other options, and the asking was practical rather than considered. What he had considered was whether the shaking was the kind that stopped when the hands had something to do. And he had decided to find out, and he had found out, and the answer had been yes, and the yes had produced everything that followed, and everything that followed was the fragment and the closure, and the dressing and the probably no and the North Callaway Range spread, and both of them were going to be there, and neither of them was going anywhere. She had stood at the water trough, and her hands had been in the water, and she had been shaking, and a man across the road had called to her, and the calling had been direct, and the directness had produced the yes. And the yes had been the first yes she had said to the work in 14 months, and it had been the correct yes, and the correct yes had stopped the shaking, and the stopped shaking had given her the probably no in a form she could hold, and the probably no in a form she could hold was the thing she had needed, and she had it, and she was going to the North Callaway Range spread, and the spread had needed the person with medical knowledge, and the person with medical knowledge had needed the spread, and the needing was mutual, and the mutual was the thing. And neither of them was going anywhere, and the hands were steady, and the wound was closed, and the fragment was out, and the probably no was accessible, and the assessment was going to happen, and both of them were staying, and the matter was settled, and it was enough. The Wednesday morning had produced what it produced, and what it produced was an axle that swung at the wrong moment, and a woman at a water trough whose hands were in the water, and a question called across a road, and a yes. And the yes had produced the kit and the needle and the thread and the cleaning and the finding of the fragment and the removing of the fragment and the closing and the dressing and the stopped shaking and the probably no in a form that could be held, and all of it was here. And both of them were going to the North Callaway Range, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the hands were steady and the wound was closed, and the 14 months were behind her in the sense that they were not over, but were being faced rather than carried. And the facing was the thing, and the facing was going to happen at the North Callaway Range spread, and both of them were staying, and the matter was settled, and it was more than enough, and both of them were staying. She'd come to the crossroads to water the horse, and had stood at the trough with her hands in the water, and her hands had been shaking, and a man across the road had called to her, and she had said yes. And she had crossed the road, and she had stitched the wound, and she had found the fragment, and she had removed it before closing. And the closure was correct, and the dressing was correct, and the shaking had stopped during the procedure. And the stopping had given her the probably no in a form she could hold. And the probably no in a form she could hold was the beginning of the facing. And the facing was going to be her work at the North Callaway Range spread. And the North Callaway Range spread was where she was going. And the going was tomorrow, and tonight was the Callaway Crossroads steps, and the Wednesday afternoon, and the wound that was closed, and the hands that were steady, and neither of them was going anywhere tonight, and the matter was settled. And the wound was on the arm, and the arm was going to heal. And the other wound, the one that was not on the arm, was going to heal too. And the healing was going to take longer, and was not going to be complete for a long time, but was going to happen here. And here was the North Callaway Range spread, and both of them were going to be there for all of it, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the matter was settled, and the arm was going to heal correctly, because the fragment was out and the closure was correct and the dressing was right. And Elsa Crane knew that, because she had done all three of those things herself with her hands that were steady when they were working. And the knowing was the important thing. And the knowing was here, and both of them were in it, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the matter was settled, and both of them were staying. The wound was on the arm, and the arm was going to heal, and the wound in the other place was going to heal too. And the healing of both was going to happen at the North Callaway Range spread, and the North Callaway Range spread was outside Callaway on the North Range Road. And the Wednesday morning had been the Wednesday morning it needed to be, and the axle had swung at the right moment, and the question across the road had been the right question to ask, and the yes had been the right answer to give, and the fragment had been in the wound, and was no longer in the wound, and the shaking had stopped, and the probably no was in a form she could hold, and both of them were going to the North Callaway Range, and neither of them was going anywhere, and the matter was settled, and the arm was going to heal, and the rest of it was going to heal too, and both of them were staying, and the matter was settled completely and finally, and both of them were staying. And the North Callaway Range was outside Callaway on the North Range Road, and the wound was closed, and the hands were steady, and neither of them was going anywhere at all. And the probably no was in a form she could hold, and the fragment was out, and the arm was going to heal, and both of them were going to be there when it did, and both of them were staying, and the matter was settled, and it held, and the North Callaway Range was outside, and the Wednesday morning was the Wednesday morning it had been, and it was enough, and it was more than enough.